Okay, let's unpack this. We've all been there, right? Feeling like people, maybe even ourselves, aren't always the most logical.
Hmm.
When you look at Wikipedia, there's this huge list of cognitive biases.
Hmm.
And popular culture, it kind of loves painting us as these cavemen out of time, always making errors.
Yeah, this idea that we're fundamentally flawed thinkers, it's pervasive.
But here's the thing that always gets me. If we're so irrational, how do we manage all this? Science, technology, better lives?
Yeah,
How did we even come up with the idea of rationality?
exactly. That's the contradiction, isn't it? We see the flaws, but the achievements are undeniable. It makes you wonder if maybe our definitions are a bit too simple.
That's precisely it. And that's what this deep dive is all about. We're jumping into human rationality. What is it, really? Why does it seem so rare sometimes? And why does it matter?
And to guide us through this, we're leaning heavily on Steven Pinker's book, Rationality, what it is, why it seems scarce, why it matters. It gives a really solid framework.
Right. So our mission here isn't just to list all the ways we mess up. It's about getting past those easy labels, rational, irrational, and really digging into how we think.
Mm.
We want to pull out some key ideas that can help you, the listener, become more aware of your own thinking and maybe appreciate just how powerful rationality can be.
Yeah, it's about understanding the toolkit we have, the strengths and the weaknesses, sharpening those tools.
Okay, so first off, let's challenge that idea. Pinker mentions that our brains are just a basket of delusions. Is that really fair?
Well, he argues pretty strongly against it. Yes, we have biases, obviously, but look at hunter-gatherer societies, like the Sand people he discusses. Their survival literally depends on accurate reasoning.
Absolutely. And those examples about the sand are just fascinating. They're not just surviving on instinct.
Hmm.
Their understanding is incredibly detailed.
Take their tracking, it's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
They can tell individual animals apart just from hoof prints. Tiny variations. They can even figure out if an animal was tired, dragging a foot, maybe stop to rest just by reading the tracks.
Wow.
Yeah.
So they're not just seeing what's there now. They're piecing together a whole story about the past and even predicting, right, like estimating how old a track is based on the sun, the dew.
Exactly. It's complex reasoning about time and evidence, not just simple observation.
And he says they even use something like Bayesian reasoning.
Yeah, it seems that way. If the tracks are unclear, they'll assume it's the more common animal. They only go for the rare explanation if the evidence is really strong and specific. They're constantly updating probabilities, basically, like detectives.
Okay, this is brilliant. They even the difference between correlation and causation. That story about the bird song and the dry soil.
Right? One tracker thought the bird caused the soil to dry, making roots easier to find.
But the others corrected him.
Yeah, they pointed out, no, it's the sun drying the soil. Birdsong just happens at the same time of year. It correlates, but it doesn't cause. That's pretty sophisticated thinking.
It really is. So this is what people call ecological rationality, or street smarts.
Pretty much. It's reasoning adapted to your environment, your specific challenges. We seem to be born with a capacity for it, and we build on it through experience, through our communities.
Okay, so we're not just irrational messes. We have this practical, grounded rationality.
Yeah.
But then, why do we get stumped by things like formal logic puzzles? Let's talk about that difference. Logic versus reasoning, and that Wasson selection task.
Ah, yes, the Wasson task.
Uh,
It's a classic for showing the gap between formal logic, deriving true conclusions from true premises, and that broader everyday reasoning we just talked about.
so refresh my memory. It's the cards, right? King, queen, bird, moose.
That's the one. You have 4 cards: king, queen, bird, moose. And there's a rule. If a card has a king on one side, then it has a bird on the other. Your job is to figure out which cards you must flip over to see if the rule is broken.
Okay, my first thought is, well, definitely the king card. Gotta check that one.
Makes sense.
And maybe the bird card, because the rule mentions birds.
And that's where most people go wrong. We naturally tend to look for things that confirm the rule,
Right.
but logic demands we look for ways to falsify it. So the correct answer is you need to turn over the king card, definitely. And the moose card.
The moose. Why the moose? That seems random.
Think it through. The rule is if king, then bird. If you flip the king and find, say, a moose, the rule's broken. Easy.
Okay.
Now the bird card. If you flip it and find a king, that doesn't break the rule. The rule doesn't say if bird, then king.
Ah, okay. It only goes one way.
Exactly. But the moose card, if you flip that one over and find a king on the other side,
Ah, then you have a king without a bird.
rule broken. Precisely. So you have to check the king and the moose. It shows how formal logic can feel unnatural sometimes. We default to confirmation bias.
Yeah. Looking for proof, not disproof.
Yeah.
I can see how that applies way beyond card games. We do that with news, with opinions.
All the time. So struggling with Weston doesn't mean we're totally illogical.
Right.
It just shows that formal logic isn't always our first instinct. Our everyday reasoning uses different shortcuts, different heuristics.
Okay. Speaking of things that mess with our instincts,
Mm.
probability. Let's dive into the Monty Hall dilemma. That one always feels like a trick question.
Oh, Monty Hall, yeah, from Let's Make a Deal, right? 3 doors, car behind one, goats behind the other two.
Yep. You pick a door. Let's say door 1.
Okay. Then Monty, who knows where the car is, opens one of the other doors, say door 3, and shows you a goat.
Right. Always a goat.
Always a goat.
Yeah.
Then he asks, do you want to switch your choice to door number 2?
And my gut just screams, no, it doesn't matter. 2 doors left. Feels like 50-50 now.
That's the incredibly common intuition. But it's wrong. Still, it feels so right.
I know. But switching doors actually doubles your chance of winning the car from 13 to 23.
How does Monty opening a door change the odds on my door?
Because Monty's action isn't random. He knows where the car is, and he always opens a door with a goat. That action gives you crucial information.
Okay. Walk me through it again.
When you first picked door 1, you had a 13 chance it was the car, right?
Right.
Which means there was a 23 chance the car was behind door 2 or door 3.
Okay, 13 on my door, 23 on the others combined. Makes sense.
Now, Monty opens door 3, showing a goat. He's essentially eliminated one of the other doors without revealing the car. That entire 23 probability that the car was behind one of the other doors is now concentrated on the single remaining other door 2.
So by opening door 3, he didn't change the initial 13 on my door, but he packed the 23 onto door 2.
Exactly. If you initially picked a goat, which happened 23 of the time, switching guarantees you win the car. If you initially pick the car 13 of the time, switching makes you lose. So switching wins 23 of the time. Okay, wow. My brain still wants to fight it, but I think I see the logic now. His knowledge and action provide information.
Precisely. And Pinger points out this confusion often comes from mixing up probability, the chance of an event, with propensity, like an object's tendency. We feel the odds reset, but they don't. The initial probabilities matter.
It really shows how formal probability can clash with our gut feelings. But, the real world isn't always about clear-cut logic or probabilities either. Sometimes things are fuzzy.
That's a great point. So much of our everyday language relies on concepts that don't fit neatly into the true-false boxes of formal logic. Think about vegetable.
Yeah, is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable? Is a mushroom?
Exactly. There's no single perfect definition. Concepts like these work more by family resemblance, as Wittgenstein called it. Things belong because they share overlapping features, not because they all meet one strict criterion.
So something can be sort of more or less of a vegetable.
Kind of, yeah. It feels truer to say a carrot is a vegetable than maybe parsley. Truth itself can feel fuzzy in these everyday judgments. It's not always binary.
And this fuzziness creates real problems sometimes, doesn't it? In law, in society. Arguments over definitions.
Absolutely. Think about defining person legally, or sex, or even just car versus truck for tax purposes. These fuzzy concepts bump up against the need for clear lines.
How does Pinker suggest our brain handles this? He mentions connectionist networks.
Yeah, briefly. The idea is that our brains might work less like computers running strict logical rules and more like networks where concepts are represented by patterns of activation. Things fit categories based on the strength of connections, built up through experience. It handles graded signals and fuzzy boundaries naturally.
Okay, so we've got this practical reasoning, struggles with formal logic, fuzzy concepts. Let's circle back to probability in some specific ways we tend to mess it up.
Right. One key way to think about probability is the frequentist view, how often something happens in the long run, like flipping a coin many times.
And we confuse that with propensity again, like that aerospace factory example.
Exactly. The guide boasts about a 99.6% security factor based on parts, but the actual failure rate, the frequency was way higher, like 9%. The frequency is what actually matters if you're flying on the rocket.
Yeah, good point.
We need to distinguish the theoretical tendencies from the actual observed rate.
Okay, what about the availability heuristic? Judging probability by how easily examples come to mind.
Ah, yes. Super common. Useful sometimes, frequent events are often easier to recall. But it biases us. Think about news coverage. A dramatic plane crash makes flying feel incredibly risky.
Even though driving is statistically way more dangerous.
Right, because the crash is vivid, recent, easily available in memory. Same with shark attacks after one gets heavy media coverage. We overestimate the probability.
And we love seeing patterns, even in randomness. The Texas sharpshooter fallacy.
Yeah. Firing shots randomly at a barn, then drawing the target around the tightest cluster and claiming to be a great shot. We do that with data all the time. Find a pattern after the fact and assign it significance.
Or the cluster illusion, seeing streaks in random coin flips or basketball shots.
We're pattern-seeking creatures, sometimes too much so.
And then there are basic calculation errors, like the conjunction fallacy, believing A and B is more likely than just A.
Yeah, the classic Linda the bank teller problem. People think it's more likely she's a bank teller and active in the feminist movement than just a bank teller, even though that's logically impossible. A conjunction can never be more probable than one of its components.
And the disjunction fallacy is the opposite, underestimating the chance of A or B happening.
Right. We mess up basic probability logic quite often.
But maybe the biggest one is ignoring base rates. Base rate neglect. That taxi cab example is so good.
Oh yeah, the blue versus green cab. It perfectly illustrates it. You're told, say, 85% of cabs in a city are green, 15% are blue. There's a hit and run at night.
And an eyewitness says they saw a blue cab. And the witness is, let's say, 80% reliable at identifying colors at night.
Right. So what's the probability the cab was actually blue? Most people jump way too high. They focus on the witness's 80% reliability.
And forget that there are just way, way more green cabs out there to begin with.
Exactly. The base rate, the 15% blue cabs, is crucial. Even with a fairly reliable witness, the math often shows it's still more likely the cab they saw was actually green and the witness made a mistake simply because green tabs are so much more common.
It's sobering. We overweight the specific story, the eyewitness, and underweight the background statistics.
Happens all the time. And related to this is messing up conditional probability, flipping it around, like the prosecutor's fallacy.
Right, where you confuse the probability of the evidence if the person is innocent.
With the probability the person is innocent given the evidence. They sound similar, but they can be vastly different probabilities. Finding a DNA match might be very rare if the person is innocent, but that doesn't automatically mean the person is very likely guilty, especially if the prior probability of guilt was low.
Okay, so probability is tricky. But there's a tool to help us update our beliefs in light of evidence, right? Bayesian reasoning.
Yes. Bayesian reasoning is fundamentally about updating. You start with a prior belief how likely you thought something was initially. Then you get new evidence, you assess how likely that evidence is given your hypothesis, and you combine those to get a posterior belief, your updated view.
So it's like, okay, I thought X was likely, now I see Y. How does Y change how likely I think X is?
Pretty much. It's a formal way to learn from experience. Like that medical diagnosis example shows, though, it can be really counterintuitive.
Yeah, the breast cancer screening one. You have a fairly accurate test, but the disease itself is rare.
Right, so a positive test result sounds scary, and people, even doctors sometimes, vastly overestimate the chance the person actually has the disease.
Because they forget the base rate again.
Exactly. When the base rate is very low, even a good test will produce more false positives than true positives among those who test positive. Bayesian calculation shows the actual probability might still be quite low after one positive test.
It really hammers home the importance of that starting point, that prior probability.
Absolutely. Which connects directly to Carl Sagan's famous line. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
How so?
An extraordinary claim, by definition, has a very low prior probability. It's unlikely based on what we already know. So the evidence needed to overcome that low prior and make the claim believable has to be incredibly strong, much stronger than evidence for a mundane claim.
Makes sense. And Picker brings up this awkward idea of the forbidden base rate, where we ignore demographic stats for social reasons.
Yeah, that's a tricky area. Sometimes acknowledging statistical differences between groups, even if factually accurate, feels socially or ethically wrong or could be misused. But ignoring those base rates entirely can also hinder understanding certain social issues. It's a complex tension.
Is there a way to make Bayesian thinking easier? He mentions natural frequencies.
Yes. Turns out our brains are much better at dealing with counts than abstract probabilities or percentages. So instead of saying 1% prevalence and 80% sensitivity, if you frame it as out of 1,000 people, 10 have the disease. Of those 10, 8 will test positive. Of the 990 without it, about 198 will test positive. False positives.
Yeah, then you can just compare the numbers directly, like 8 true positives versus 198 false positives.
Yeah.
Much clearer.
Much clearer for most people. It makes the impact of the base rate more intuitive.
Okay, so Bayesian reasoning helps us update beliefs. Now, what about making choices? Rational choice theory.
Right. Rational choice theory isn't really about predicting what you'll choose. It's more a framework for thinking about what choices would be consistent with your values and preferences, assuming you're trying to maximize something usually called utility or satisfaction.
It's based on those axioms, right? Like, if you like A better than B and B better than C, you should like A better than C, transitivity.
Exactly. Axioms like transitivity, commensurability, you can compare any two options. Independence, irrelevant options shouldn't change your preference between two others. Consistency, they define what it means to make consistent choices aligned with stable preferences.
And that funny story about Morgan Besser and the pie. He violates independence.
Hey, yeah. The waiter asks if he wants apple or blueberry pie. He says apple. Then the waiter says, oh, we also have cherry pie today. And Morgan Besser says, in that case, I'll have the blueberry.
Uh-huh. Makes no sense logically. The cherry pie shouldn't change his preference between apple and blueberry.
But it highlights how our real-world choices don't always follow the neat axioms.
Like the paradox of risk. We buy insurance to avoid risk, but then we gamble, seeking risk. How does the theory handle that?
That's a puzzle. Maybe the shape of our utility curve is complex. We value avoiding small losses highly, insurance, but also overvalue tiny chances of huge gains, lottery. Or maybe non-monetary things matter, the peace of mind from insurance, the thrill of gambling.
And this theory can even touch on really sensitive stuff, like valuing human life and policy decisions.
It can, though it gets ethically very complex very quickly. Though one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic idea, might reflect diminishing marginal utility. Each additional life saved adds less subjective value, but applying that formally is fraught.
Yeah, we definitely violate the axioms sometimes.
Yeah,
Taboo trade-offs, things we refuse to put a price on.
right. We resist comparing sacred values like life or loyalty with mundane things like money, even though our actions often imply such trade-offs implicitly.
And framing effects. How you word the choice changes the decision, even if the outcomes are identical, like medical treatments presented as survival rates versus mortality rates.
Absolutely. 90% survival sounds much better than 10% mortality, even though they're the same thing. Prospect theory tries to explain this. We evaluate gains and losses relative to a baseline, and losses loom larger psychologically than equivalent gains.
Which explains why we make weird financial choices sometimes. Buying extended warranties that are statistically bad value.
Could be loss aversion. The pain of a potential future repair cost feels worse than the smaller certain cost of the warranty now. Or choosing low insurance deductibles even if higher ones save money long term.
It even makes you question everyday risks like speeding. Is the tiny time saved really worth the increased danger, rationally speaking?
It forces you to think about how we actually weigh costs and benefits versus how a perfectly rational agent might. Often there's a gap.
Okay, another aspect of decision-making, dealing with uncertainty. Signal detection theory.
Right. Signal detection theory is about making decisions when you're not sure if a signal is really there amidst background noise. Think of a doctor looking at an X-ray for a tumor, or radar operator looking for a plane.
There are 4 outcomes, right? Hit, miss, false alarm, correct rejection.
Exactly. A hit is seeing the tumor when it's there. A miss is not seeing it when it's there. A false alarm is thinking you see one when it's not there. And a correct rejection is correctly seeing nothing when nothing's there.
And the cat on the hot stove example shows the trade-off. The cat learns to avoid all stoves, even cold ones.
Perfect example. The cat becomes very conservative. It minimizes misses, getting burned again, but maximizes false alarms, avoiding perfectly safe cold stoves. You adjust your response criteria and how much evidence you need to say yes, signal, and that shifts the balance of errors.
Be trigger happy, you get more hits, but also more false alarms. Be gun shy, you get fewer false alarms, but more misses.
Precisely. And this maps directly onto type I and type 2 errors in science.
False positives and false negatives.
Right. A type I error, false positive, is like a false alarm rejecting the null hypothesis when it's actually true, finding an effect that isn't real. A type 2 error, false negative, is like a miss failing to reject the null when it's false, missing a real effect.
The standard p0.05 significance level means we accept a 1 in 20 chance of a type I error, right?
Basically, yes. Which sounds low, but if you run lots of tests.
Like that XKCD cartoon testing jelly bean colors for causing acne. Test enough colors, one will look significant just by chance.
Exactly. And that leads to the file drawer problem. Studies that find no significant effect often don't get published. So the published literature might be biased towards positive, possibly false positive results.
Okay, so we're making decisions under uncertainty, often interacting with others. Game theory comes in here.
Yes, game theory analyzes strategic interactions. How rational actors make decisions when their outcomes depend on what others do.
Simple case. Zero-sum games. Like rock, paper, scissors. My win is your loss.
Exactly. Pure conflict.
Yeah.
But most situations aren't zero-sum.
Like the game of chicken. Two cars driving at each other.
Right. Both swerving is okay. One swerving means they lose. Neither swerving is disaster. Here, appearing irrational or committed to not swerving can be a strategic advantage. It makes your threat credible.
And escalation games like the dollar auction. How we get trapped by sunk costs.
Oh, the dollar auction is brutal. You auction off $1, but the rule is both the highest bidder and the second highest bidder have to pay their last bid.
So people get drawn into bidding way more than $1 just to avoid losing what they've already bid.
Exactly. A perfect illustration of the sunk cost fallacy, throwing good money after bad because you can't let go of the initial investment.
And the most famous one, the prisoner's dilemma. Why cooperation is so hard.
Classic. Two suspects arrested, kept separate. If both stay silent, cooperate, they both get a small sentence. If one racks out the other, defects, while the other stays silent, the defector goes free, the silent one gets a long sentence. If both defect, they both get a medium sentence.
And the rational choice for each individual acting alone is always to defect, right?
Yes. No matter what the other person does, you personally do better by defecting. But if both defect, they both end up worse off than if they had both cooperated.
A tragedy of self-interest leading to a suboptimal outcome for everyone.
Unless you can change the game. Enforceable agreements, contracts, laws, authorities, things that change the payoffs, making cooperation the rational choice, or punishing defection.
And this applies to bigger things. Public goods games, tragedy of the commons.
Definitely. Think climate change. Everyone benefits from a stable climate, the public good. But each individual country or company might feel it's in their self-interest to pollute, defect, leading to a worse outcome for all if everyone does it. We need mechanisms to enforce cooperation.
Okay, game theory helps with strategy. Now, a really fundamental skill, telling correlation from causation, huge source of error.
Absolutely massive. Just because two things happen together, correlation, doesn't mean one causes the other. Ice cream sales and crime rates both go up in the summer. Does ice cream cause crime?
No. Probably the heat influences both. A third variable.
Exactly. Or it could be coincidence. We need to be so careful not to jump from correlation to causation. Pinker uses that rubber band and tax analogy for regression lines.
Yeah, showing the average relationship, but also the scatter, the residuals.
Yeah. The line shows correlation, but it doesn't prove causation. Sometimes the problem isn't even jumping to causation too quickly. It's failing to even establish a correlation properly in the first place. We just assume two things are linked.
And we also misinterpret things because of regression to the mean, like the sophomore slump or the Sports Illustrated jinx.
Perfect examples. An athlete has an amazing rookie year, way above average. Their second year is likely to be closer to their average just by statistical chance. Not because of a jinx, but regression to the mean. We invent causal stories for random fluctuations.
It's hard to really prove causation, isn't it? The fundamental problem. We can't see the counterfactual, what would have happened.
That's the core issue. We only see one reality. Randomized controlled trials, RCTs, are the best tool we have because random assignment tries to create two groups that are identical except for the thing being tested, letting us isolate its effect.
But even with RCTs and complex stats, human behavior is still pretty unpredictable, right? Even identical twins aren't perfectly correlated.
Nope. Genes and shared environment explain a lot, but there's always a big chunk of variability left over. Humans are complex systems.
Okay, so we've mapped out what rationality involves. But Pinker's title also asks why it seems scarce. Let's talk about why we often appear irrational. Biases, my side thinking.
Right. A huge factor is motivated reasoning. We don't just process information neutrally. We often have a stake in the outcome. We want certain things to be true or false.
And that shapes how we look for and interpret information. Biased assimilation, selective exposure.
Totally. We seek out stuff that confirms what we already believe, and we avoid or dismiss stuff that challenges it. And when we are forced to look at opposing views, we critique them much more harshly. That's biased evaluation.
The my side bias just generally favoring our own side, our own beliefs.
It's incredibly powerful and pervasive.
Is it all just social media's fault? Conspiracy theories online?
Pinker argues, no, not fundamentally. Those things might amplify it. But the human tendency towards groupishness, towards believing narratives that flatter our group, towards suspicion of outsiders, that seems much older and deeper than the internet.
And sometimes our reasoning isn't even aimed at truth. expressive rationality.
Yeah, where the goal isn't accuracy, but signaling belonging. I believe this because people in my tribe believe this. The social reward of fitting in outweighs being factually correct.
So the reality mindset, actually trying to align beliefs with evidence, might be kind of unnatural,
Mm.
especially common in weird societies.
That's his suggestion. For much of history, maybe a mythology mindset was more common, where beliefs served social or moral functions, not just factual ones. The strong emphasis on empirical truth as the main goal might be relatively recent and culturally specific.
Which could explain why weird beliefs, claptrap as Pinker calls it, persist. People don't always hold them as literal facts.
Possibly. Or pseudoscience and quackery tap into our intuitions like mind-body dualism, making ghosts seem plausible.
Or our pattern-seeking drive makes us see connections and agency everywhere.
Exactly. We're wired to find meaning. Sometimes we find it where it isn't. And maybe science communication doesn't always do a great job explaining the basics, leaving intuitive but wrong ideas unchallenged.
And fake news spreads because it confirms our biases or makes us feel morally superior.
Or strengthens group bonds, yeah. It's often less about the information itself and more about the social act of sharing it.
Okay, so lots of reasons why rationality seems scarce. But the final, crucial question, why does it matter? Does being rational actually help?
Pinker makes a very strong case that yes, it matters immensely. Failures of reason have real costs. People dying because they reject effective medicine for quackery, people losing life savings to scams.
And there's a correlation between reasoning skills and good life outcomes. Better health, safety, success, even apart from general intelligence.
The evidence suggests so. It's not just being smart, it's applying reason effectively.
And on a bigger scale, rationality is the engine of progress, isn't it? Public health based on germ theory dramatically increased lifespan. That's rational inquiry winning.
Absolutely. And moral progress, too. Reasoned arguments against slavery, torture, oppression, Enlightenment thinkers using reason to argue for rights and equality. That's rationality changing the world for the better.
So even though we see irrationality, the long arc bends towards reason. We don't burn witches anymore.
Generally, yes. And we've built institutions to help universities, peer review, fact-checking, ideally a free press. Even something like Wikipedia, for all its flaws, is an amazing example of collective error-correcting rationality in action.
Okay, so wrapping this up, rationality isn't just about avoiding mistakes. It's this incredibly powerful toolkit for understanding, for deciding, for making things better. Biases are real, part of us, but so is our capacity to reason. And that capacity has achieved incredible things.
And for you, the listener, trying to navigate all the information out there, understanding these principles, the biases, the tools like Bayes, the logic pitfalls, it really can empower you, help you think more clearly, make better choices.
Definitely. And I want to leave you with this quote Pinker uses from Peter Singer. It's quite profound. Beginning to reason is like stepping onto an escalator that leads upward and out of sight. Once we take the first step, the distance to be traveled is independent of our will, and we cannot know in advance where we shall end.
Wow.
So keep stepping onto that escalator. Keep exploring reason. You never know where it might take you.